Okay, can I go ahead? All right. If you remember when the BDS campaign in South Africa started, it was a handful group of ANC activists who had a meeting in 1958, I think, or 1959, in London. A handful of, ANC activists who called on the international community to intervene. I will slow down, all right? To intervene. Sorry. And actually, at the beginning, the BDS campaign against apartheid South Africa was not that successful. But after the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, and then the Soweto Intifada uprising in 1977, I mean, there was a momentum. And as I said to you, I mean, the European governments, including the Western governments, including the American government, never supported the BDS campaign. And we need also to remember that some South Africans did not support the BDS. For example, the chiefs of the Bantustans. Well, the chiefs of the Bantustans, I mean, their interest was in their relationship with the apartheid system. The Transkei Bantustan, for example, was recognized only by one country in the world. And surprise, it was Israel. Right? It was Israel. So, yes, I mean, the same thing applies to Palestine. I am on the steering committee of PACB, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel. Now, we are actually supported almost by all Palestinian universities. Almost by all Palestinian universities. Almost by all cultural institutions. The first BDS call officially came out in 2005, signed by 171 civil society organizations. Now, you can say that almost all Palestinian civil society organizations have endorsed that call. On the BNC Secretariat, BNC, the Boycott National Committee, you have representatives from all nationalist and even Islamist parties, including Hamas, including Islamic Jihad, PFLP, Fatah, and most civil society organizations. In other words, there is almost a consensus around, BDS in Palestine. And when did we start? I mean, that is the question. And as I said, I mean, South Africans told us, Archbishop Tutu, Archbishop Ronnie Casserles, our friend Ronnie Casserles told us, I mean, what you've managed to achieve within 3 years is like a miracle compared to what we achieved within 30 years. So yes, sometimes you find some people, some individuals who are opposed. I mean, I myself, for example, think that, the very existence of the Palestinian Authority, or rather the Palestinian Authority, is the embodiment of normalization. Is the embodiment of normalization, to tell you the truth. And therefore, I personally, but this is not the position of the BNC, but I personally believe, and that leads to the second question about negotiations, that we need to dismantle the Palestinian Authority. Really, we need to dismantle the Palestinian Authority. Okay, I think I'm taking more time. I'll leave Mazin to... Yeah.
The other question was concerning your passport.
Yeah. If you show them passport at the board, at what they consider the border, which is the wall, it's not any border, it's just the wall around the Bantustans, then they will not accept to let me in. And I tried that 2 times just to see what happens. You have to have a valid tourist visa, which I do not have, obviously, being a Palestinian. And as I said, also in the middle of my passport, it is stamped that this guy is a Palestinian and he has an ID card number such and such. Now, I do want to comment on the issue of the politics of what's happening, and this is as I agree with Haidar on the notion of creating an authority under occupation. The word authority implies that you have authority, right? Now, when our Minister of Transportation, we have a Minister of Transportation. Minister of Transportation needs to get a permission from the Israeli authorities to move from one place to another, and then he really does not have authority. It is really essentially what we have, the situation is analogous to a prison and that's the best analogy I can give you, is in a prison, sometimes the prisoners, like people who are more accommodating to the prison guards, are willing to talk to prison guards and tell them what they want to hear, etc. And sometimes the prisoners, they like the tough guys, guys who will stand strong against the prison guards. But we have to remember the ultimate authority is still with the prison guards. It is still with the prison authorities, not with the prisoners. So to have an authority within the system is really counterproductive. I agree with this. And this is the problem with Oslo. My late friend Edward Said actually was the best analyst for Palestinian history. We really miss him. He was a professor at Columbia University. I encourage you to read his book about the Oslo process, because he's the one who termed it a second Nakba, initially. And I think that it is a second Nakba for us. But ultimately, I think it's a waste of our time, your and my time, to spend too much time thinking about what Abu Mazin should be doing, what Hamas should be doing, what others should be doing. We should look in the mirror and say, what am I doing? What is it that I am doing? And in this, I want to comment on the issue of the sensitivity in Germany, because I may not have a chance to comment on this, about the work for human rights in Germany on this issue being the history of Germany and Nazi Germany. I urge you, I plead with you to read history first, because the real history is not what you are led to believe about what happened. The Zionist movement actually collaborated with the Nazi movement. This is now a fact that's available in many books. Read, for example, Jewish American Lenny Brenner has a book called 51 Documents, History of the Nazi Zionist Collaboration. Read Edwin Black, another Jewish guy who wrote a book called The Transfer Agreement, on the signed agreement between the Yishuv in Palestine and Nazi Germany. Read books like Naim Giladi, an Iraqi Jew, who wrote a book called Ben-Gurion's Scandals, where he documents these things in detail about what Ben-Gurion did against Jewish interests. Ben-Gurion himself, when there was a choice of sending some Jewish children to England and save some Jewish children to England, and they came to him with this plan, he stood, and maybe Ilan Papi could comment on this, being a historian more tomorrow, if he chooses to. But Ben-Gurion himself, in a meeting of the Mapam party, he said, this is very well documented, he said, we reject this, I reject this. I reject the idea of moving children from Europe to England, because if I had the choice of saving all the Jewish children, by taking them to England, and only half of them by bringing them to Eretz Israel, Palestine at the time, we should choose the latter. Because we should not put the interests of these children ahead of the history of Judaism and Zionism. In other words, he's putting Zionism ahead of the lives of Jewish children. This is Ben-Gurion, who became the first Prime Minister of Israel. I think Jews need to know this history. I think Germans need to know this history. I think Israelis need to know this history, so that there's no sensitivity when we talk about what Israel is doing. Israel does not represent Jews. And anybody who claims Israel represents Jews, you see why they do that. They do that to protect themselves from international law. Thank you.
I wanted to comment that this did not answer the question which was asked before. The question was what the United States authorities say to the fact that you are not allowed to enter Eastern Jerusalem.
Okay, sorry. Sorry, I thought she asked about what the Israeli authorities say. No, I approached the State Department about this. The U.S. State Department makes an exception even for U.S. law for Palestinians. There are American citizens today in Israeli jails being tortured and held in administrative detention who get very little support from the American State Department. This is unconscionable. The reason for that is that there is a very strong Zionist lobby in Washington that makes sure that the State Department does not do its duty of protecting people like me, American citizens who are living in Palestine, also being Palestinian. This is outrageous, and I think we should all speak out against it. But unfortunately, and we are speaking out against it, I had the American consul actually in Bethlehem just last week, and he assured me that he will follow up on some of these questions. So I hope that he will. I hope that American administrators become more aware of what's going on.
Ja. Okay, es war noch die eine Frage, was...
Negotiations, do you want us to answer or did we answer that? You answered. I did? Okay. All right.
Ja, aber es war noch die Frage, ob es bekannt ist mit der grünen Linie, was sozusagen westlich von Salfit liegt, ob irgendwas darüber bekannt ist, dass sozusagen Salfit westlich israelisch werden soll, ob es ein Wissen darüber gibt, dass das tatsächlich so ist.
Yes. Actually, the plans that are laid out now and that are being negotiated about territorial swaps, exchange of territories between the 22% of Palestine that would become a Palestinian state and the state of Israel, which is the rest of Palestine, 78% of Palestine. These things were discussed in 1968, actually, believe it or not. There is a plan called the Alon Plan, which was very clear about what areas Israel wants to control in the West Bank, remarkably similar to the plans that are being discussed now. They include the natural resources of the West Bank. That's the most important thing. The reason this village of Al-Walaja is threatened is because of the natural resources, the water in that area. So obviously Israel is interested in putting Palestinians in the poorest areas without natural resources and calling it a state. And this is what is being discussed. So unfortunately there is some validity to this. But I must say, and maybe Haidar could comment more on this as far as negotiations, international law is very clear that any agreements that abrogate human rights and international law is null and void, is not acceptable, even if some Palestinians signed on it. When Chief Boutalezi signed on the Bantustan plan in South Africa, he was violating international law, and so his signature means nothing. The Oslo agreements also, signature means nothing because they violate international law. And this is, any international lawyer can tell you this. You cannot have agreements between an occupied, colonized people and the occupiers who are holding all the cards. This cannot be a fair agreement. They have to comply with international law.
Yeah, can I address that?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Regarding negotiations, I shared a platform with Hayo Meyer. Some of you must have heard this name. I mean, he's a Holocaust survivor. Hayo Meyer. Yeah, from Holland. Exactly. From Holland. And we addressed the House of Commons in England and, you know, in Ireland, Scotland, and so on. And we were asked about negotiation. This is what he had to say. He said, you don't bring a mouse and an elephant and you lock them up in a room and then you ask them to negotiate. I mean, and I like that a lot, actually, because you need to bring a fair lion in order to support the mouse. And this is exactly what has been going on since 1993. Actually, you have the Israelis, the fourth strongest army in the world, 450 and more than that nuclear heads, and Merkava F-16s, and the Palestinians on the other side have absolutely nothing, and they do not have the support of the United States of America. I mean, Yasser Arafat, when he signed the Oslo Accords, he lived an illusion, a fiction, that the Americans and the Israelis would be granting him an independent Palestinian state on 22% of the historical land of Palestine. And the moment of truth came actually in 2000, Camp David, when he realized that he was getting absolutely nothing. I mean, 40% of the West Bank, I think ultimately 54%, something like that. And then he decided not to go ahead, because that doesn't guarantee the right of return, that doesn't guarantee Jerusalem, that doesn't guarantee anything. Now the problem is that the Palestinian leadership has believed in this, or rather has fetishized independence instead of liberation. And what we are fighting for is liberation, not independence. You can have a Palestinian empire in one of the refugee camps. Who cares? And honestly, and this is a farce. This is a farce. And as I said, Nelson Mandela said only free men can negotiate. And these men are not free men, unfortunately. That's my answer.